Alrighty, everybody. Welcome back to the Auto Hawker podcast series. On tonight, I have William Walker back with us to discuss what we were continuing with in our first episode about the Knights of the Golden Circle and filibustering in general. Well, William, how are you doing tonight?
Well, first of all, good evening, Otto. Thank you again for having me back on. I'm sure you know, and I'm sure that you feel exactly the same way. I'm doing absolutely fantastic. We took our country back. We've had the greatest political victory since perhaps I can't even remember. I mean, obviously 2016, but looking at what the Reagan administration in 81. So I'm feeling fantastic. We witnessed a miracle. We truly did. So I'm doing great. How about
There's,
yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. There's definitely a lot more optimism in the air. I was kind of doubting the results of next week, but one of the things I think about why the victory of Trump was enabled, and I don't mean to go on a tangent on this, is I think when Vice President Harris directly said, to the guy shouting Christ is Lord at her rally, that, that place wasn't for people like him. He was at the wrong rally. I kind of think Trump, to some degree, has been placed in office more or less to punish the people that said that.
Yeah, no, absolutely,
Whether
absolutely.
literally punish them or not, but I believe that their victory was taken away from them because of that. That's a whole other topic, but that's one of the things I'm kind of starting to take from it is that God will not be mocked.
Amen. Amen.
So anyway, I believe when we left off last time, we had just ended with the American Civil War and the disbandment of the Knights of the Golden Circle. I believe we talked a little bit about some conspiracy theory stuff in regards to people like Jesse James being members and people hiding gold, um, things of that nature. Um, I don't think we ever got into any post-war Southern militant groups like the Klan or the Red League or groups like that operated in any kind of paramilitary structure that might have had some kind of resemblance to the Circle. But we also talked in the last episode too about the Circle was a physical place. And concerning the history of the Golden Circle, it didn't end at 1865. So would you like to start us back on the history trail?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Golden Circle is essentially an area known as the Spanish West Indies, which of course, the center of it was Cuba, and then you had Mexico, Nicaragua, and of course, all those other countries, Colombia. And the reason why this area was strategic, not only because of the fact that it was situated in between the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, but also because of the fact that it was an agricultural society already in waiting to be taken over. Right, that's how Southern planners saw it. That's how many American industrialists and capitalists saw it. They saw it as a gold mine waiting to be taken over. And of course, after the Mexican American War, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we capture the rest of what was then Norte de Mexico, right? Northern Mexico, we take it for ourselves. We are now a nation from sea to shining sea. We are seeing a major increase in industrial wealth. We are seeing the expansion of the railroads. So the country is exploding. And of course, comes the issue of slavery with the Wilmot Proviso, bleeding Kansas. We have all these issues that lead up to the War of 1861, as I like to call it. And we see a halt in that because there were certain people who thought that no, we didn't want the slave powers expanding southward. But no, the Golden Circle is an area of interest even after the war, as we shall see, because the very people who were against annexing these countries for the benefit of the southern states, as they saw it, would later on attempt to actually do so, and in some ways successfully did so later on.
Alrighty. Well, let's. I guess let's I don't know if you would loop it in with this, but would you say that we could start with maybe the post Civil War Mexico as a starting place to begin with some of this activity? Would you consider that in the realm of the Golden Circle with the the involvement of Emperor Maximilian down there and Confederate troops, Confederate immigrants, fleeing to Mexico and Belize at the end of the Civil War, trying to seek a new life down in this Golden Circle?
It's an interesting question you just raised because in no time that I've read. Oh, obviously, I'm obsessed with this topic, so I've read a lot of material about the Golden Circle, a lot of books and articles, and it's interesting. This is the first time that question is raised, so thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, nobody's ever really talked about it in those terms. The Confederacy after the war, a lot of Confederates, more than people would think, actually expatriated to Mexico immediately after the war, especially those serving in what was called the Trans-Mississippi Theater. You had the most notable Confederate to do so was, of course, Joe Shelby of Missouri. He actually, the legend is that he dumped his Confederate flags in the Rio Grande before crossing over, and he and his men actually went down into Mexico to offer their services to Emperor Maximilian. Of course, that did not go very well in the long run due to different unfortunate turn of events there. But yes, a lot of Confederates did expatriate to Mexico primarily at first, and then later on there was another wave of expatriates who went to Brazil and whose progeny are still there to this day. Their descendants still live there in a place called Santa Barbara del Oeste, and they immigrated there beginning in the late 1860s through the 1880s because the imperial government of Brazil actually offered them that land. It was a land grant given to them so they could work the land because they knew that they needed it, and they knew that they were actually agriculturally inclined, so they were able to till the land and work it and help the Brazilian economy. So a lot of them moved there. And interestingly enough, and this is one of my favorite parts, there were some that went to Cuba and joined the fight in the 10 Years' War, which started in 1868. The most notable Confederate officer to do so was General Thomas Jordan, who actually fought in several of the key battles until about 1873. And he would be able to see the first fighting in the War for Cuban independence. So several Confederates fought in those conflicts, and they fought against the Juaristas and Benito Juarez's forces on behalf of General Maximilian as well. So yeah, that definitely happened. Now, the idea behind that was that some of these individuals who were members of the Knights of the Golden Circle, by the way, they wanted to essentially create a protectorate with Maximilian's Mexico and revive the Confederacy in Texas. It was called the Lone Star Strategy. And the Lone Star Strategy was essentially something like this. We had General Kirby Smith, we had, Generals Shelby and others, and they said, well, look, we're basically separated from the rest of the Confederacy. So what we're going to do is that we're going to create our own government here and then form an alliance with Mexico, with Maximilian Mexico. And that way, with our combined forces, with the French and our own forces, and potentially even the Spanish, because Spain was trying to annex and take back Santo Domingo. So with that alliance, the plan was to essentially revive the Confederacy, take back the lost territory, and basically start a new government from there.
Interesting. The only really idea or recollection I have of anything remotely close to this is it was a John Wayne movie called what was the name? I can't remember.
Oh, I know what you're talking about, The Undefeated.
Undefeated, about basically it's basically a Confederate army unit basically that fights John Wayne's men in like one of the last battles of the Civil War. When the war ends, they just decide to go to Mexico, and John Wayne and his troops more or less say, "Hey, like we don't have much to really go back to either. Why don't we just go down to Mexico with y'all and all offer our services as troops for Maximilian?" And I believe when they get down there, there's something. Spoiler alert ahead. I think the movie kind of portrays it unrealistically. I believe that when they get down there, Maximilian betrays them, and they have to basically fight French army soldiers down there. And there's like this really weird scene of because it's the Civil War in the beginning. They're using like muskets and things like that, and then like by the time the movie's over, everybody's got a Winchester rifle and Colt single action army, which didn't exist until 1873. I mean, they still had I mean, after the Civil War that next year, I mean, there were literally Civil War revolvers that had been manufactured and shooting metallic cartridges. That's besides the point. But the idea that I'm trying to get you to see is that in the audience is that the movie goes from like being the Civil War movie in the first half to like it's a just full on Western movie, and you have all these former federal and federal cavalry soldiers and Confederate soldiers with like Winchester rifles and basically dressed up like cowboys fighting like French dragoons on horseback while they ride wagons and they like are like these war wagons. It's a very odd movie. It has a happy ending though.
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with the movie. It's actually one of my favorites. It's a great film, and yeah, that's essentially it's based off of Joe Shelby's March into Mexico. And they essentially they did not surrender. They basically did not surrender. They said, no, look, what we're going to do is we're still an army, we're still a government, we're still intact. We haven't been defeated, hence the name. And they just crossed over. They didn't see themselves as a defeated group of men. They saw themselves as a body of legitimate troops going over and negotiating with what they saw as a potential ally. So
that's not the first time in history something like that's happened. I know during after the Battle of Poltava, when Charles XII of Sweden fought Peter the Great in the Northern War, Charles actually fled to Turkey, or what was Turkish territory at the time. I don't think he might have went to Istanbul, but basically him and his whole army fled there, and they lived I think for 2 years in the Ottoman Empire as basically what's that term? What's the term that you hear it used a lot, like in reference to like people fleeing like communist regimes that America houses? What do we call them? There's a particular name or word I'm thinking of. Not refugee, but like oh, they seek political asylum.
Yeah, political asylum, exactly.
Basically, that's what these that's basically what it was. Was like they were in political asylum in Turkey for like 2 years, or Ottoman territory for 2 years, because the Russians literally ran them into Ottoman territory. So it was more or less about survival than it was oh, we're just trying to reform a new government. It was no, we're a long way from home, and we have to get somewhere that's not Russia.
Yeah, those draw a lot of parallels. Those different asylum seekers.
But a lot of Confederates after the war didn't even they expected to be executed, because as bad as they like to kind of sort of hide the those that write the history. They don't tell you about that during the war in a lot of places in the South. I think of one instance in particular in Tennessee. There were 12-year-old boys that were executed for squirrel hunting by federal troops because they were wandering around the woods with guns. So people, that kind of stuff was more common during the war. And of course you have Sherman's March to the Sea. So a lot of these Confederates think that they're just going to be executed.
Yeah, no, they were waiting a death sentence. As a matter of fact, now that we're on the subject, there was actually that's the reason why the CSS Shenandoah When they surrendered, they were, by the way, they were the last body of Confederates anywhere to surrender. They surrendered in Liverpool, England, and rather than the United States, because they were branded as pirates by Lincoln's government, which by that time Lincoln was dead. But these radical Republicans were in power, and they were branded as pirates essentially. So had they come to the United States and surrendered as regular soldiers or any other naval body would, they would have been executed on the spot. They would have been hung without a trial, without any sort of due process. Obviously, they would have been just killed on the spot. So that's why they surrendered in England rather than the United States. And many Confederates just refused to surrender
entirely
because of the fact that they were going to be killed. And yeah, I could think of many horror stories during the war and afterward of Confederates just being executed for the fact that they were pro-Southern or actually enlisted in the Confederate Army. There's one story that really stands out to me because it's something that you would see today too, actually. And the reason why I say that is because of Antifa and their reign of terror. But so this man, when in federal occupied New Orleans, this man actually pulled down a U.S. flag in protest of the occupation, and he was lynched for it.
Yeah, there were many such cases in the war. I was thinking of a particular incident. After the war, that like they killed Henry Wurz, the guy that ran Andersonville.
Yeah.
He was tried and executed when it was pretty clear that the reason why the conditions there were so bad is that the Northern military had blockaded the South, and when you have it's like being in a prisoner of war camp in 1945 Germany. You're not getting food because the country's surrounded on all sides. It's just like don't expect if you're going to be a prisoner of war in a country that's losing the war, your conditions are going to be worse than the side that's winning the war.
Exactly. And, think about this, and this is what really upsets me about that. The North, they deliberately starved Confederate troops because they had the resources. They had everything they needed on hand to feed Confederate soldiers and properly take care of them, whereas they purposely withheld those resources. In the South, on the other hand, the Confederacy was basically being starved to death by a blockade. Their crops and all of their other material resources were being destroyed, especially we're talking 1864. Sherman was cutting across the South and burning everything in sight. So how could they provide for all these prisoners? They could barely even provide for themselves. It was just logistically impossible. So at that point, there was no war crime done, and Wirtz was an innocent man. That's the bottom line.
And and on the topic of it, you're talking about the people surrendering and things like that. A lot of Confederates didn't even surrender; they just went back home. I know of a particular incident where that did happen, and essentially the man and the group he was with got jumped by Union cavalry soldiers, I believe, for basically just being like partisans because they had guns. They were heading on their way home, and they had a gunfight, and one of the men was killed like less than probably 30 miles from his house.
Yeah, there were many such cases. One that I could think of in particular was with the Kentucky Orphan Brigade. So the Kentucky Orphan Brigade, by 1865, they actually found themselves in South Carolina. They never made it to Virginia. They were detached from the Army of Tennessee. They were actually mounted infantry by that point, or as they call it, dismounted cavalry. And they were fighting in western South Carolina, skirmishing. And rather than surrender, what they did was that after all the skirmishes were over, they just disbanded and just went home to Kentucky and to Tennessee. They did not formally surrender because, again, at this time, federal policy was execute Confederates. They were wanting to execute Jefferson Davis. They were wanting to execute Robert E. Lee. I believe that they had actually wanted to take General Lee to be executed, and it was Ulysses S. Grant who intervened on his behalf and said, wait a minute, we surrendered with them on very generous terms. And Robert E. Lee, is my friend, and he did nothing wrong. He did what he had to do, and we're going to leave him alone now. It was time to come together. And yet, these bloodthirsty radicals, they didn't see it that way. They wanted to outright murder these ex-Confederates. But going back to the topic of filibustering, that's why a lot of them just left the country and decided to become, either mercenary soldiers or they essentially just became fighters for other causes, such as General Jordan, such as General. There was another one. He escapes me now, but also such as General Shelby in Mexico. All these men had no other choice than to leave their home. Probably the most famous example of this, even though he wasn't a soldier, he was a Confederate politician, was the Confederate Secretary of State Judah Benjamin, who fled to England and became an attorney there.
Yeah, I knew about that. I don't think he ever moved back to America.
No, he never did. He never did. He became a barrister in the United Kingdom and a very successful individual there.
And I know that there's also there was some Confederates that went to Africa and they fought for the Egyptian government against Ethiopia down there.
Yeah. General William Loring. William Loring was very famous for actually going to Egypt and offering his services to the caliphate there. Actually, he actually fought on behalf of the Egyptian government there at the time. And General Beauregard was actually going to do the same, which I'm surprised that he didn't, but he was able to sort of go back to New Orleans and contribute in his own way. But many Confederate generals just did that, and it was the only alternative because until the end of Reconstruction, until reconciliation really began, it wasn't safe to be an ex-Confederate and be in the South. Unless you received a direct pardon, unless you were friends with somebody on the inside in the U.S. government like Lee was with Grant, or maybe say like James Longstreet was, it was very dangerous and very difficult, which is why you see the proliferation of groups like the Klan, which is why you see proliferation of groups like the Red Shirts, because really it was just chaos and anarchy. But
I mean, really, if you think about it too, they don't consider the was it the Battle of Liberty Palace? They don't even really consider that in with the Civil War. But I really would, because the militia, the red shirts that fought there were all entirely Confederate veterans versus probably Confederate veterans in the National Guard of Louisiana.
Yeah, they revolted against the corrupt Reconstruction government there, which was the Kellogg regime, as I call it. And at the time, Governor Kellogg, who was the military governor put over Louisiana, he was corrupt as a person can get. I mean, if you read on this guy and what he was doing there, it was horrible. There were a few states where Reconstruction was really unusually bad, and Louisiana was one of those states. Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida saw some particularly awful Reconstruction years. Also, Alabama and Mississippi, of course. Pretty much the Deep South saw the worst of it. And so these individuals, it was the White League in Louisiana in particular, and the Order of the Magnolia, they got together. I'm sorry, no, the Order of the White Camellia. The Order of the White Camellia and the White League, they got together, formed a militia, and fought against the Kellogg government to basically take back control of the state in the Battle of Liberty Place. And this was, if I'm not mistaken, this was in 1876. And unfortunately, they lost, but this was just one instance of people trying to reassert their rights. Think about it. If we were, God forbid this ever happens, but if we were, say, pro-Trump MAGA patriots and we were singled out and stripped of our liberties, stripped of our rights to vote, stripped of our rights to assemble, and we had to take a stand, I mean, that's essentially what happened there.
And also, and on a, odd side note about the battle, I always called it Liberty Palace because I could never remember if it was Palace or Place. I thought Palace sounded cooler than Place.
Yeah.
And from the pictures I've seen, it looked more like a palace than a place. But it's weird because the red shirt militias, I was saying earlier, this was a time like by this time people had, access to what we call cowboy guns, like Winchester lever actions, Colt revolvers, things of that nature. But from my understanding, a lot of the weapons that the red shirts were using in that battle were like Prussian Dreiser rifles, Dreissy rifles, Chassepot rifles, which were the French rifles at the time. Just very like shotguns, but they weren't using what we think of as like American weapons. It was almost as if they all said, "Hey, like foreign backers," which probably was the case. Foreign backers, or black market backers were able to give them all the same stuff. It's kind of like if you look at the Easter Rising, most of the Irish people, IRA members that took part in that, if you want to call them IRA, they were using German guns. They weren't using British guns, which you think they would, but most of them were using Mausers and things. So it's just kind of interesting to think that they gave them all these really like what's a Prussian needle rifle doing in New Orleans? It's just weird that they couldn't get them privately in the Civil War, but they can get them afterwards. I guess because the blockade, but that's besides the point. It's just another event that's not talked about much, but we're here to talk about filibusters, and I would consider a shootout in New Orleans isn't really a filibuster, nor nowadays is it really a particularly unusual event.
Yeah, for all the wrong reasons.
All the wrong reasons. About in every major American city, there's a shootout or something every day.
By a certain demographic, but anyway.
Speaking of war, go on a little bit about the 10 Years' War. That's something I really don't know much about.
All right, so this is Cuban history now, and the 10 Years' War was a war that began in Cuba on October 10th, 1868, when the plantation owners there had finally had enough, and after several decades of failed attempts at liberation via filibustering expeditions, the most famous one being the one we covered last time with Narciso Lopez and his men, which was largely financed by Southern planters, the Cubans took it upon themselves and they said, hey, look, obviously, the United States just went through a civil war. We're on our own right now. So this is in our hands, boys. We got to come together and do something. So what are we going to do? And one of the plantation owners, his name was Manuel de Cespedes. Yeah, he basically said, well, look here, we're going to arm our slaves and get together and fight the Spanish, because they're going to release the slaves anyhow, because they got to pay their debts to the United Kingdom, and they don't want to do that. They don't have the money, so what they're going to do is free the slaves. So we might as well do it ourselves and arm them and have them under us, and we'll see what we do about them later on. And so Carlos Manuel de Cespedes basically proposed this, and then several other wealthy planners agreed to it, and they started the war. Now, this is 1868. The American Civil War is over for over 2 years now. Reconstruction has just really begun. It's kicking in. And, they're forcing the southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which doesn't even make any sense, because first they said they're in the Union and then they say they're not. So they just militarily occupy it. It's crazy. But so all this is going on. And so several ex-Confederates say, well, you know what? Let's help these guys out, because this is our real chance to possibly take Cuba for us. And we were there to begin with. We've been on their side, and these are our guys, so let's just go in there and help them out. And so Thomas Jordan, who was a former aide to General Beauregard, goes down there, he basically checks the situation out and says, you know what, yeah, I'm going to fight for these people. And he fights in the very first battles all the way until about 1873, when he sees that it's okay to actually come back home to his native state of South Carolina. And an interesting thing happens in the 10 Years' War, because the 10 Years' War was the first time since probably 1817, when Jackson invades Florida, that we came extremely close to actually going to war with Spain. And what happens here in the 10 Years' War is that a man by the name of Joseph Fry, who was one of these Confederate expatriates, was in charge of a gun running ship called the Virginius, and the whole incident is called the Virginius Affair. And so what occurs is that this man, Joseph Fry, who, just to give you a little background on him, he was actually a Floridian. He was a Florida man. He was born in Tampa Bay, Florida. How about that? Florida man doing Florida man things. One of the first Florida men to, because before that there weren't that many people actually born in Florida, but he was one of the first Florida men out there just gun running to Cuba, and in July of 1873, his ship, the Virginius, is actually seized by the Spanish government. And what occurs is that his men are seized, they are searched, and basically executed. They're summarily executed. A whole bunch of them are killed by the Spanish for aiding the rebel cause. It causes extreme outrage, of course, these evil, dark Spaniards murdering Americans. So the whole United States is in a fervor. They want to go to war. However, the United States just went through a major war where over 600,000 plus people were killed on both sides. So, at this time, Grant is president, and the Secretary of War is William Tecumseh Sherman, and at that time, the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, he was trying to do his best to avoid an actual confrontation with Spain. So he basically says, look, is there any way that we can not go to war with you, because you've murdered some of our people and people are calling for blood. So if you're not willing to negotiate with us, we might have to go to war. And this is where it gets interesting. So because of this whole incident, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's actually friends with this Fry guy, right? And they're actually Freemason buddies, if I'm not mistaken. And so they're friends. They had served together in the war, and he gets wind of this, and pretty much the entire South, regardless of the fact that the war was just fought and that the Union was their enemy, they were angry because these were their guys, their brothers in arms, being held in bondage and executed. So this wasn't like, oh, it's some U.S. ship that was seized and these were all New Englanders in there. No, these were their friends, people that they knew. And so what occurs is that Forrest actually sends a telegram to Sherman and offers his services to the war effort in case they actually go to war. As a matter of fact, what occurs next is interesting. Sherman was horrified of Forrest. As a matter of fact, I believe it was Sherman who said it would take the entire Federal Army, or at least an army of 10,000 men to kill Forrest. So Sherman was extremely terrified of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so because Sherman saw how formidable an opponent Forrest was, he said, hey, we're not going to war, but it would have been an honor to have him in the ranks with him, because he knew that had he brought this guy in, he would have made short work of the Spanish. So, but the South really wanted to go to war with Cuba, Spain. Think about that. They were still for expansion for several reasons. One of them was, of course, to improve their economic situation. Another one, of course, was, again, as I mentioned, these were their friends. These were actually Southerners being held by Spaniards and executed. So it was an outrage. It was an offense to the Anglo-Southern people. It was an offense to their families. It was an affront. So they said, these bloody Spaniards, we're going to have to fight them and kill them. And they were willing to go to war with their enemies, with their conquerors, in order to finally take Cuba, which later on would occur. It would take place. They would get their chance 20 years later.
And the U.S. Army there would be led by a former Confederate general.
Yeah, well, actually, more than one. It was because Fitzhugh Lee. So this is interesting. because there were many small instances of filibustering activity after this in between period of the Spanish American War and the American Civil War. And in the next 20 years, what we see is a major flurry of activity in Florida, mostly, which I'm proud to say, in Florida. Um, we see a massive flux of filibuster activity in Florida, and the Cuban liberation movement, with such famous men as Jose Marti and so forth, they come to Tampa, they come to Jacksonville, and they form outposts here with sympathetic people in these areas who are mostly ex-Confederates, who were familiar with their cause, and they are then able to gather more weapons and supplies from these hubs. And there was a famous incident that occurred during the Grover Cleveland administration in his second time as president, called the Three Friends Affair. And it's one of my favorite stories because the Three Friends Affair was essentially a situation, another gun running situation in Cuba that involved the governor of Florida, future governor of Florida. He wasn't governor yet, but this would help him get elected. Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. So one of our governors, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, was a filibuster at this time, and he would actually go to Cuba and help the rebels arm up and train. And his ship, called the Three Friends, was gun running. However, the Spanish government knew that he was doing it, and he was blatantly saying it. He would go all around Jacksonville, Florida, and basically say, "Hey, yeah, I'm actually filibustering, and I'm violating U.S. law and Spanish law. How about that?" He was like the ultimate OG at the time. Everybody loved him, and he didn't care. He didn't care. And so the Spanish said, "Okay, well, they knew Grover Cleveland was a pushover, and they knew Grover Cleveland. He was a Jeffersonian, which is funny because Jefferson wanted Cuba too. But Grover Cleveland was more. He was one of these isolationist guys. Grover Cleveland did not want war with Spain. Grover Cleveland said, "Hey, look, we might have to look into this guy because the Spanish authorities are coming to me, and they're basically asking me what is this person doing and helping out these insurgents." So Cleveland basically wired this guy to stop. He told Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, "Look, we're not exactly going to turn you in, but we're not going to protect you from them either. So, you're on your own." And of course, he said, "All right, whatever, LOL, whatever. Let them try to capture me." And they never did. They never did. And from 1896 all the way until the actual Spanish-American War begins in 1898, this guy is running guns. And later on, this is the best part, he actually uses it as a campaigning point when he becomes governor of Florida, and I believe it was in 1908 when he was elected the 16th governor of Florida.
What did he do during this? Did he have any involvement in the Spanish-American War, or did the gun running kind of more or less stop then?
Oh no, he was actually running soldiers and guns.
Oh,
So this guy was a great hero. I mean, this Napoleon Bonaparte Broward is one of my favorite governors, aside from our current one. He's the one that ranks up there. He ranks high in that order of my favorite governors because he was a great man. He was a populist. He was one of the later Democrats. He was not a Bourbon Democrat. He was a populist Democrat who revolted against them, and he was one of the great guys who brought a lot of reform to the state.
interesting.
But then, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, what if there's a kind of a common theme that's going on throughout this in the Spanish Americas, and it seems like the Spanish government is really incompetent at governing their colonies. When they were, they used to have the most land in the world, and then this happened. Could you explain maybe what's causing sort of the Spanish incompetence?
Yeah, well, this goes way back. So Spanish incompetence begins roughly around 1807. And the reason why that is because not only is there a shift in government, but Spain is invaded by Napoleon. And so pretty much all of Spain's social order, all of Spain's resources are wiped out until about 1814 when Spain was able to recapture the peninsula. But in that time, Spain's holdings in the Americas were completely eroded, and Spain had stretched itself thin. Because remember, Spain had fought in the 7 Years' War. Spain had fought in the War of Jenkins' year before that. Spain had fought a series of endless wars, and this is why endless wars are bad for countries in the long run. Endless wars aren't a healthy thing. People say, "Oh yeah, it's healthy to fight endless wars because it's constant conquest and you get all the spoils." Not necessarily true. You also get debt, lots and lots of debt, and lots of disorganization, and that's what happened in Spain. So, because of all of this, because of the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Spain is at an impasse, and it's left in a position where they're basically choosing a new government, which is where the Carlist Wars come in, and all of their top people are actually on the peninsula fighting, duking it out, killing each other. Meanwhile, you have all these distant governments in Cuba, in the Philippines, in, say, I think it was the Spanish Sahara, yeah, and they're just on their own. Okay, there's nobody really in communication with these people, and so they don't know what to do. So what happens here? Well, blatant corruption is one of the things that happen, and they basically form their own little, fiefdoms. And what occurs is that we see little prototypes of what we have in Latin America today, these little corrupt, power-hungry individuals ruling these countries with an iron fist. And there isn't a whole lot of wise decision making, not a lot of long-term thinking when they're running these colonies, which is what essentially angers the colonists to begin with and why there's even these problems. But of course, they didn't see the big picture. They were just like, oh, these are just little rebels. We're going to kill them all, whatever. And that's where a lot of this arises from, just blatant corruption. And as you said, incompetence. They're really, the best people were all killing each other in Spain while the holdings were pretty much left on their own until, Spain started to realize that maybe they should start paying more attention to what was going on outside.
Interesting. Do you think we've progressed a little bit enough to possibly get into the Spanish-American War?
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to cover one more actual episode of the Spanish West Indies and filibustering. So, in this in between period, another interesting thing happened, which didn't once again involve Ulysses S. Grant and his government, and that was concerning the annexation of the Dominican Republic. And it was a proposed annexation by Grant in 1869 through 1871. This was essentially the period that this was discussed. It was never officially, brought forward. It was never actually drafted down. But Ulysses S. Grant had his eyes on the Dominican Republic, or as they called it, San Domingue at the time, because of the fact that he wanted to bring over the freed slaves and just dump them on the island. He said, "Well, look, which is pretty base, but he said, look, they're already mixed. Even though they declared their independence from Haiti, they're still next to Haiti, so maybe they'll just migrate to Haiti, if anything, and we'll have the Dominican Republic as a state, and it's rich in agriculture. It's a great place for us strategically. Let's take it." But of course, the rest of his party said, "No way, we're not gonna do that." And unfortunately, that did not go anywhere. But that was going to happen. We were going to annex the Dominican Republic, and you know what? We should have. Even though now, we have the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or as other people call it, the floating island of garbage.
Yeah.
We have that out there. But I think it would have been beneficial at the time. You know, maybe a lot of the tensions that we saw probably would have been avoided had we taken the Dominican Republic and made it a state. Because if you think about it, at that time, the United States needed growth. That was a time where the United States needed to actually grow out and reignite its economy and try to fix itself, which is what Grant was basically saying. But of course, nobody else was buying it. But yeah, now we can finally move on to the ultimate phase where filibustering is sort of vindicated, and it's vindicated in the strangest way, as we shall see.
Alrighty. So did you, when in preparing for this, did you get a rundown for the Spanish American War, or do you want to maybe divulge into a completely new episode on the Spanish American War?
Oh no, this is this is everything that I love. So let's go right into it. So the Spanish American War. So it's one of those wars that people just really don't think about, right? It's a forgotten war, and I just call it the Spanish War, the conquest of Cuba.
And a lot of people get it confused with the Mexican American War as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, they do, and it's very similar. And it's not. It's similar in a sense because we're going to war to potentially claim extra territory for an offense that may or may not have been committed by
A
Spain.
foreign,
That's I say they did it. I think they did do it. I think that the USS Maine was blown up by the Spanish, by a mine perhaps. Other people argued the contrary, but I think they did it. And if yellow journalism helped to get us into the war, then good on them.
and it's a weird war because people view it like in this lens of like they act like, oh, like it's like this like Civil War era conflict, or oh, like it's this like kind of 1800s war. No, like this is basically World War One. It's I would call it a proto, um just like you have the there was like the Italian Turkish war or something like that, or the Serbian Bulgarian war, I think, before like World War One. I would say, or the Boer Wars. I would say the Spanish American War is almost sort of like America's. It will get them ready for World War One. Probably the or the Pancha Villa expedition more so, but I mean, you look at all the weapons that are used in it. You look at the tactics employed, and it's essentially a modern war.
Yeah, it's the first modern war that the United States fights, and basically this is the culmination of everything we talked about is this. And so obviously Spain is at this point a major enemy of US interests for a lot of reasons. One, because they're a desperate crumbling empire who's actually forming an alliance with Germany, who at this time is seen as somewhat of a hostile power. And Spain is acting very aggressively against the U.S. in the Caribbean. And there were also business interests in Cuba that were interfering with this situation. This was essentially a time where the United States did want Cuba, where the Republicans had finally reached a point where the United States was once again reconciliated. And there was a great amount of prosperity being seen by this time. This was the apex of the Gilded Age. We're seeing the Gilded Age. We're seeing mass prosperity, also mass corruption, right? But we're seeing a lot of an industry and a new industrial revolution taking place, which leads to all these modern weapons being employed. As we'll see, this is the first time that we see an iron fleet being utilized against a much older fleet by the Spaniards, which that was thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, who, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, saw to it that they built these iron warships, these steel warships, and these modern guns on these warships. They basically were the first destroyers and cruisers. And so what's going on is that Cuba produces the vast majority of our sugar, our tobacco, and American business interests are actually in Cuba at this time. And they don't want a war, by the way. These guys actually don't want a war because they're businessmen. They want things to continue to be as smooth as possible. But Spain is very hostile to them. Spain is cutting off all diplomatic relations with the United States. And not just that. Of course, what was his name? The man who created yellow journalism.
Was it it was some, was it not Ernst?
William Randolph
Hearst.
Yeah, so Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World and William Randolph Hearst. I can't remember what he was from. I think it was the New York Times, New York Journal. So these guys, they're basically writing about these tensions, and they're also talking about the ongoing war in Cuba. They're talking about the ongoing affronts against Americans, helping the Cubans, and not just them. Of course, they're the most famous examples, right? But they're basically covering what's going on over there. And a lot of Americans, North and South, in New England and the rest of the country, basically considered their fight for freedom to be basically another war of independence, like their war of independence, like the American Revolution. They saw this as their version of the American Revolution. And because they were only 90 miles away, there was a lot of ties there. They saw them as their fellow brothers wanting freedom, and they wanted to bring them in as a state, or perhaps at the very least liberate them and let them have their own government. But regardless, this was the general attitude, and there was a great deal of hostility with the Spanish government because of their atrocities that they were committing. And so what occurs is, and here's the funniest part. So the person responsible for sending the USS Maine to Cuba was actually Fitzhugh Lee.
Interesting.
Fitzhugh Lee was actually ambassador to Spain at that time. And he basically says, well, look, he was an envoy. He was an envoy to the Spanish in Cuba, Fitzhugh Lee. And so he basically says, look, things are looking pretty bad over there. They're actually rounding up their citizens and putting them in concentration camps. And they're all dying of yellow fever. They're all just being killed. So maybe we should actually go in there and try to stop this. Now, the Spanish government, they had actually changed hands. So when this happens, there was a change in government in Spain. They were actually more liberal, and they had agreed to U.S. pressure to basically stop these camps. So these camps were basically containment camps made by the Captaincy General of Cuba at the time to contain the rebels and keep them more or less under control. But the liberal government in Spain said, well, all right, fine, we will stop this and let them go. However, Fitzhugh Lee says, no, you know what? Let's actually send the USS Maine into Havana, into the harbor, and hopefully things will not escalate from there. Now, was this done, to spark a war? I don't know, but it definitely did it. Oh, by the way, he was consul. The word is U.S. consul to Cuba. Fitzhugh Lee was the consul to Cuba. But yeah, so he sends the cruiser Maine. They agree. They send it out. And of course, what happens next is that on February 15th, 1898, at approximately 9:30 p.m., the Maine explodes. It's just a massive explosion. I think something over 350 sailors are killed. The rest are wounded. The 94 survived. Only 16 weren't injured. So it was the biggest loss of American life since the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was approximately 240 men. So think about that. That was a very significant amount of life lost in one incident on foreign soil with a hostile enemy. So
No wonder
they,
war is going to happen.
yeah, yeah. And of course, the United States is clamoring for war. McKinley doesn't want to go to war for the same reason that the business interests don't want to go to war. He says, look, we just got out of a panic. We're enjoying great prosperity. We might not be able to do this. But of course, Teddy Roosevelt, with his connections, he's able to convince them to go to war. They do. And we see a comeback of Southern patriotism at this time. A lot of Southerners actually volunteer, and not just as regular soldiers, but we see the comeback of men like General Joseph Wheeler. Fighting Joe Wheeler fights as a general in the Spanish-American War. And of course, Fitzhugh Lee does as well. And many Southerners actually fight on Cuban soil and finally liberate Cuba from Spain. And several things are happening here. There are talks of annexing Cuba to the United States at last. There are discussions of how the United States is going to set up the provisional government in Cuba. But unfortunately, there is an amendment made. There's actually a change of plans made that made sure that Cuba would not become a state, but rather that they would be given their independence, which, I mean, I don't know how that would look today. I don't know if that was the right choice, but that's what was agreed upon. They said, look, we're going to change plans here. We're not going to actually bring Cuba into the United States. But something called the Platt Amendment essentially brought together a provisional government that was overseen by the U.S. government. So the United States government oversaw the provisional government of Cuba from 1898 to 1902. And then they officially withdrew from Cuba, I believe it was in 1918, 1920. So there was an occupation force, and obviously we have the base to this very day. We still have a base there, which is a result of this, which is Guantanamo Bay.
Interesting. Do you want to begin like talking about actual like U.S. troops landings into Cuba? I know a little bit about the war in the Cuban campaign of the goal was Santiago, and I know a little bit about the Battle of San Juan Hill, with the charge up the hill, and there were two positions they fought over. There was the San Juan Heights, there was San Juan Hill, and there was Kettle Hill, and Roosevelt and the Rough Riders actually it's kind of like Bunker Hill, where at the Battle of Bunker Hill they didn't fight at Bunker Hill, they fought at Breeds Hill, but the Rough Riders attacked. They didn't attack San Juan Hill, they attacked Kettle Hill.
Yeah, well, there were several. There was a series of battles that took place, and of course, the initial landings, they were basically very bloody at first because the Spaniards were actually armed with the Mauser 1893 rifle, so they were actually superiorly equipped. The United States had I believe it was the
Krag Jorgensen.
Krag Jorgensen
And
rifles.
from my understanding, these Krag Jorgensens they're not bad shooting rifles. The problem is that they, compared to other, basically whatever, I mean, even the Japanese were using, basically the loading mechanism for the Krag Jorgensen is a lot more complex than standard bolt action rifles. And the viewers, probably don't even know what I'm talking about, but on most bolt action rifles, you open the action and you can basically load, one bullet at a time if you want. But in most military contexts, people use what they call stripper clips, which are a strip of ammunition kept by a metal clip, and you basically set it in the chamber, and you push it down, and you pull that clip out, and you can engage the action and get your gun ready to shoot. Well, these Krag Jorgensens were a little odd because they had a box on the side by the action, and to load the gun, you would basically have to open up this box and put, I believe the Krag Jorgensen also shot 6 rounds. It wasn't a five. It was odd. Most bolt action rifles are 5-shot rifles. I think the Krag Jorgensen might have held 6, and that basically you had to load this ammo in this box, but it wasn't like you could just throw it all in there, and then you had to kind of load it a certain way in there, and then close the box and then engage the action. Whereas the Spaniards, they just got to open the action, put a stripper clip in, and they're ready to go. It was also believed too the Krag Jorgensen might have been a black powder rifle, and so a lot of people, they think of these metallic cartridges after the Civil War, they think of them as they're like modern bullets, but they're not. They're cartridges, but they're not. They're still using black powder, so there's still smoke. I think. Don't quote me on that, but I think the Krag Jorgensen might have been a black powder metallic cartridge rifle, whereas these Mausers that were being used were smokeless powder. And on top of that, U.S. troops, I don't know if the majority of them were using them or not, but a lot of them were equipped with breech loading trapdoor single shot Springfields that were essentially, looked just like the muskets they used in the Civil War, except they accepted a metallic cartridge, which is, I will say this. You would rather have one of those than a real black powder musket from the Civil War in a gunfight. But for, a time where everybody has bolt action rifles or Springfield rifles, or bolt action rifles and machine guns, you don't want a breech loader that every time you shoot, you have to flip open that trapdoor and insert a cartridge and close it and then pull the hammer back to shoot. It's just too much when you can have a guy that, has 5 shots and all he has to do is pull that bolt back, versus every time you shoot, you got to fumble with loading a cartridge in there. I guess the best way to think of that for anybody that would be wondering is, imagine you were in a gunfight with the guy who, we both have bolt action rifles, but the guy you're fighting, can shoot his whole 5 shots, and all he has to do is cycle the bolt. Whereas every time you shoot, you have to pull the bolt back and insert a round and close the bolt. It would just get annoying. You'd constantly have to reach into your pocket or whatever you got the ammo in. Where instead, this guy can really just actually focus on shooting for a little while. And also, they used the officers, at least the Rough Riders, they used Model 1895 Winchesters.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You had a well-equipped Spanish army, and you had these the Springfield Model 92 and 99, which were basically the trapdoor rifles. But yeah, they were somewhat more modern, but nothing compared to the Mauser 93. And so, they were initially coming over what they felt was extreme resistance, but they were able to come and break through. Now, the first major action that took place was actually on May 11th, and that was after Spain had declared war on the United States. They felt they had no choice, and so the United States did the same, and they said, well, all right, we're going to send the troops over there. And it was a naval battle called the Battle of Cienfuegos, which was along the coast, and it involved the ships, the USS Marblehead and the USS Nashville, and they were dispatched to basically cut communications to begin the preliminary bombardment for the final land attacks. And 2 men were killed in this engagement. These are the first men to be killed, and so they actually even sent some Marines over to cut the communications. All the Marines were actually able to do that successfully, and for their heroism, they all received the Medal of Honor. So that's some legendary action right there. And Speaking of Guantanamo Bay, the very first campaigns begins at Guantanamo Bay. They land on June 24th, and finally, all the troops finally get off and going. General Joseph Wheeler, he was just really eager for action. General Wheeler is shouting and screaming. I don't know if you've actually seen a movie called Rough Riders.
I've heard of it. I was actually in getting ready for this. I actually kind of watched the scene of the Battle of San Juan Hill.
Well, it's funny because in the he's already an older man, so he's starting to become a little senile. So when he's leading his troops, he's actually saying, let's give him hell, boys. We got to whip these Yankees.
No. I think the actual quote he said, because he actually said something to that effect, but it was even more extreme when they one of the first battles, something to the effect of basically they put the Spanish on the retreat, and they were like I think like when I say they put them on the retreat, like we're talking about like in combat. And Joseph Wheeler basically wrote it and said like my goodness, we're rolling the Yankees up like a wet pillow or something like onto them or something like that. And apparently, a lot of the troops that were on the ground fighting when he said that were Northerners, and they really did not like him saying that.
I imagine.
And knowing Joseph Wheeler, he's basically like a second tier Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you couldn't get Nathan Bedford Forrest to lead troops in Cuba, you might as well get Joseph Wheeler.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Bedford Forrest died a lot earlier, but can you imagine, though, Nathan Bedford Forrest leading troops in Cuba, how epic that would be?
I imagine he would suffer probably the same fate as Frederick Sellis did fighting in World War One in Africa. Forrest strikes me the kind of guy that, he would be leading from the front, probably, shooting off horseback, leading a charge just for a Spanish, sniper to shoot him in the head. Some travesty of modern war killing him.
Yeah, that might have happened. Unfortunately, a lot of Confederate soldiers a lot of Confederate generals actually died that way in the war itself. They weren't used to modern warfare. Although I think Forrest probably, I don't know, Forrest didn't really strike me as the kind of guy to. I mean, he did do that a lot of times where he actually rode into Federal lines. Funny that you mentioned this because at the first engagement where General Wheeler was famously saying this, it's called the Battle of Las Guasimas, and he actually does what Forrest did in the Civil War. He actually goes into the advance guard of the Spanish army and is actually forced to retreat because he was ambushed that way. And he engaged a Spanish rear guard of about 2,000 soldiers.
Well, he probably learned that from Forrest to some degree because, him and Forrest are both cavalry commanders in the same, both in the Army of Tennessee. And I imagine that Forrest probably left some kind of impression of what a soldier must be to Joseph Wheeler. And, being from Alabama, Joseph Wheeler ended up settling down here after the war, and he was a congressman for the state, so he's kind of a state hero. Most people don't know who he is, but if you know your Civil War stuff in Alabama, you know Joseph Wheeler.
Yeah, fighting Joe Wheeler. No, he was actually a very, very underrated cavalryman. He was the one who harassed Sherman's lines outside of Atlanta until the retreat into Tennessee when they regrouped with Forrest.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so they were able to fight at the Battle of Las Guasimas. That was the first major land action, and basically because of General Wheeler and his failed attempt to drive back the Spanish forces by, trying to force them, basically by riding into them, they were forced to retreat, and they were continuing to pursue them. Afterward, later on, they would fight continuously through the Battle of El Caney, all the way to the Battle of San Juan Hill, just outside the city of Santiago. This is the famous battle where we have the Battle of San Juan Hill, the charge. We see, of course, the Rough Riders riding up the hill, And well, it was a very, believe it or not, the battle was not as one sided as people think, because not only were they dealing with these Spanish Mauser rifles, they also had, uh, I guess what we would call the Gatling guns. They had the Spanish had their own version of that, and they were using these to check U.S. forces that were advancing, and they also had some precise artillery being used on them as well. So basically, they were forced to entrench, and then they made the famous charge of the hill. That's why it's so famous, because they were forced to basically double down under the fire and then just ride on in. But the United States had actual Gatling guns of their own. They were able to employ better artillery as well, and they basically bombarded the Spanish forces overnight. And on the next day, they charged and obviously took the hill. And then afterward, there was the Battle of Tyacoba, where the 10th Cavalry, which were basically made up of buffalo soldiers,
Mhm.
fought a bunch of Spaniards and were able to rout them as well. So that's what happened there. But that wasn't the only fight going on. Look, this is where Puerto Rico comes in. This is where we got that island. And while this was happening, they said, well, why don't we take Puerto Rico too? And it's funny because Henry Cabot Lodge basically told Theodore Roosevelt in May of 1898, when all this is happening, that Puerto Rico is not forgotten and we mean to have it. So at that time, the United States sent troops to Puerto Rico. And at first, what they sent was a reconnaissance mission to sort of like test them out, draw them out. And then on May 12th of 1898, a squadron of 12 ships commanded by Rear Admiral William T. Sampson of the United States Navy attacked the capital of San Juan. Battle of San Juan Bay was fought. The Spaniards, they only had a few cruisers, the cruiser Isabel II and the Terror. They counterattacked, but they were basically damaged. I think one of them was sunk. And so afterward, they successfully took Puerto Rico as well. And then, of course, you had the famous Battle of Manila Bay with Admiral Dewey.
Mhm.
And, that's a very, very interesting battle, because Germany was actually in the outskirts waiting to intervene on Spain's behalf, but they decided against it.
Interesting. I think that's like during the Russo-Japanese War. I believe at the Battle of Port Arthur, there were other European military units that were there. I could be wrong on that, but I believe there were some British and maybe even also German too ships that were there. And my thought is that when you're in a war zone and somebody's shooting, at some point somebody's going to shoot at you. They're going to assume you're a threat, so you're probably best in a war zone, honestly, to try to just fight to some degree. If you're in a situation like that, I'm actually surprised those German units did not get involved in the fighting.
No, no, and
Or,
it
they,
foreshadowed World War One to a great degree.
or they were just attacked, because like I was saying, a lot of these instances, we think of like, oh, like like I'm depressed, like don't shoot me. It's like a lot of times it seems like, from what I understand of war, that when the shooting's going on and stuff like that, a lot of soldiers are just going to gun down what's in front of them,
Yeah, yeah,
or they're going to attack what's in front of them, especially if you're in the way. You're in the middle of it. Um, you're probably going to be getting shot at, and it's best to do whatever you can to survive. Um, so what do you know concerning the most famous event of the war, the Battle of San Juan Hill?
Well, I know for a fact that obviously Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, right? That was like the epic scene of the battle, and of course the overwhelming fire that they were under at the beginning was just something that a lot of people don't think about. But that it was the Spanish American War. Look, the Spanish American War itself, and that battle in particular, basically raised American morale and helped the healing of the South and the North once and for all. Basically, just completely come together. Reconciliation really happens after that, and the reason, again, being, as we said earlier, is that a lot of ex-Confederates fought there. And, I forgot to mention this, but there were more than just two famous Confederates who fought in that conflict. And in particular, the action at San Juan Hill. There were men like Matthew Butler, who was a Confederate military commander in South Carolina. There was Thomas L. Rosser,
Mhm.
who was a brigadier general, and he was from Texas. Thomas Lafayette Tex Rosser, and these were all men who fought in the Confederate Army, whether in the Army of Northern Virginia, Army of Tennessee, or other theaters, who made that charge together. So afterward, that was the cementing of reconciliation, and it was the birth of American imperialism. It was the birth of American imperialism. This is, we see the Roosevelt corollary, the famous Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine being applied. We see, the end of the Spanish Empire. These are major implications that come from this battle in particular, and obviously the battles in Manila Bay and San Juan, Puerto Rico. And whereas we agreed not to take Cuba and instead help them form their government, we did take Puerto Rico. It's a commonwealth today. So that's what I have to add with that. Are there any observations you'd like to make on it?
Mainly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Battle of San Juan Hill. It's the most famous event of the war, and a lot of people don't know what happens. And basically, there at the battle, the Spanish were, it was over. It was they were trying to siege Santiago, and hills in general, heights are a good place to defend. And so the U.S. military had to take these San Juan Heights, and so they had a group of, I believe it was the 10th New York. There was also a group of Buffalo Soldiers, and there's the Rough Riders. Now, about the Rough Riders, only one, I believe, one company of them made it to Cuba, and it was Company A, I believe. The other companies were forced to stay behind in Tampa. Also, on another note, they were a proper cavalry regiment, but they had to leave their horses behind in Florida, so they essentially were having to be infantrymen. And the Rough Riders at San Juan Hill fought at Kettle Hill. And Roosevelt would say that really the reason why they even took the hill was because of the Gatling guns were able to, basically keep the Spanish pinned down on the heights while they advanced. And in the fighting too, and I was saying this is like pre-World War One. They would a lot of people think of World War One, they'd do these like going over the top, trench attacks. That they would just launch these like, well, they weren't supposed to be stupid suicidal wave attacks, but you wouldn't send like all your group that's going over the top at one time. You would send waves. And at the Battle of San Juan Hill, these U.S. troops were advancing in rushes or waves. And the idea is that when you take casualties, it's not like the whole group as a conglomerate is not taking casualties at one time. It's you got these little pockets of men, and that's what they did. That's what they did in World War One. So I guess that was kind of like I haven't researched it too much, but I guess that was kind of the idea of modern war at the time. And I guess it to some extent is today. I know they do bounding and things like that, but the idea is you're gonna leapfrog with troops, and that's how they made their way up San Juan Hill. And the Americans took, if I remember from reading casualty lists, the the casualties for the Americans were way more than the Spanish. But the thing with the Spanish is that they pretty much fought to the death on top of that hill. One thing I read said to the knife. So they meant business. We think of like the Spanish troops in the Spanish American Wars, like like they're these low morale men that probably are from Spain, they don't even want to be there. Um, no, it seems like they fought to the death for a reason. They believed they were correct in the war, and you know, and a lot of the deaths that in the war were caused by malaria. But from my understanding, basically the Battle of San Juan Hill was really like the like real serious battle of the war. I know you talked about was it Las Guermas?
Oh, Las Guasimas. That was the
Las
first major
Guasas.
action.
That was
That was the one that made Wheeler famous, where he basically said they were rolling him back like a carpet.
pretty much, all the battles before San Juan Hill were, more like skirmishes, and I mean they had serious combat, but San Juan Hill is like what we think of like as a set piece battle. And after that there was basically this siege of Santiago, and the war was over. Like the war in Cuba was over like 2 weeks after that. So
Yeah, there's a saying that yellow fever was more of an enemy to the U.S. there than the Spanish. I don't know if
yes,
it's true, but that's what I've heard.
and but other than that, the Spanish American War has always been related to me more like in a more global setting, like putting America on the world stage. It's never really poised in a way of understanding, Caribbean American relations. And a lot of times when in history class, the Spanish American War was talked about, it would be in conjunction with the Philippine Wars and the Moros and all that stuff. So and Guam and things like that. And I know that too, after the Spanish American War, the U.S. is going to look into things, especially in the Roosevelt administration. You know, places like Panama, things of that nature, and I guess to some extent Alaska, because the Alaskan gold rush is going on at this time, the Klondike gold rush. Alaska is really being, I would say, Americans are actually going up there for the first time. You know, so it kind of is like almost like I don't want to call it like the last frontier, because the frontier is is more or less dead now at this time, but it's kind of like the last bit of American colonization. That project that started on the tidewaters of Virginia, and in the beaches of Boston. Basically is coming to the end. In Panama and Alaska.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Panama, the country of Panama, the Panama Canal, because I think there's a meme or something where basically Teddy Roosevelt um, caused a separation of Panama from Colombia in order for them to build the Panama Canal. And I don't know how accurate that is, but it sounds about right. It's pretty base too, because we wanted to build the Panama Canal through there, and Colombia was obviously not really having it. So we said, "All right, fine. We'll step in and have them separate from you."
Yeah, and it's funny to think that America controlled the Panama Canal all the way up through the Cold War. And I believe it was the Clinton administration was the one that got rid of it. Um, so and I hope the viewers have been able to hear me. I've been kind of sitting back more, and I just kind of caught on to it. So I might not be picking up that good in the recording later. Um, I just realized I was laying back in my chair, so my voice is probably more muffled. Um, but that's really kind of where my knowledge ends in regards to Cuba. The only other thing I really know much about is the Bay of Pigs invasion, and I imagine you'd want to talk about that in a later episode if we go down that far.
Yeah, well, a lot of things happen after the Spanish American War in Latin America. We see a major movement into Latin America, obviously Panama, The Republic of Panama is established in 1903. We have the Panama Canal
There's the
established as a
banana
result of that.
wars.
And of course, we then move into the there was a small incident that occurred with Mexico again. I believe it was in 1913, and there's even a song about it by Warren Zevon called Woodrow Wilson's Guns.
Mhm.
And basically, the Woodrow Wilson went to Veracruz, to the port of Veracruz, and blockaded the port in response to Mexican rebels and their incursions into the United States. To my understanding, that's what happened there. So that was another little episode in Latin America where we were sort of, intervening. And then, of course, there were the Banana Wars in the 1920s on behalf of the U.S. Fruit Company, which is really based. You have a private fruit company sort of filibustering down in Guatemala and Costa Rica and all these other countries. And so you have the U.S. Marines going down there to fight for their right to basically have bananas grown down there.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1920s and 30s, we send troops to occupy the Dominican Republic once again. And that is when we implement a regime on the Dominican Republic, which is very famous, which would be the Trujillo regime, which would come later on, which would end in 1960, 61 roughly, with the assassination of Rafael Trujillo. But yeah, there was a lot of involvement in Latin America in that time, and the Bay of Pigs invasion is probably one of the last instances where the United States is like really trying to shake events in Cuba up in their favor. Of course, that ends in a complete catastrophe, and people like to pin the blame on the Kennedy administration, but the blame is really on the CIA and, of course, on the previous administration, which had really been the one overseeing that, which was Eisenhower. But that was the last instance where we tried to sort of meddle in those affairs. Now, you could argue and say, no, there's plenty of instances, and pretty soon we're going to have to go down and meddle in their affairs again. And that's probably true. I think that Mexico is an enemy state. I think that the current administration in Mexico, to my knowledge, has not congratulated Trump on his victory.
Oh yes, Miss Scheinbaum has.
Oh, she has.
Yes. Most people have. Though I will say that I find some issues with the current Mexican regime because they specifically they're anti-Columbus, and I'm just not going to go there.
Yeah, they're anti a lot of things, and one of the undercurrents is that they're anti-American.
I just think it's odd that they'll claim dignity and human rights, and they'll talk about like, oh, Columbus was such a bad guy, when they're literally headquartered in one of the places that probably saw the most human sacrifice in human history.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, they see a lot of bloodshed today, which, I mean, arguably some of them are sacrifices, because here's the thing. A lot of these groups they're doing what's called decolonization, and, Latinx, pride, and all of that. So they're moving back to their pagan roots, and they're sacrificing people. These cartels are sacrificing people to their gods. So these cartels, they're very ethnically inclined. They're very much about bringing back their Aztec roots, what have you. And from what I've heard, they actually make sacrifices to their gods for protection in exchange for that protection, so they can run their drugs and all of that. That's what I've heard. I don't know if that's true, to what extent that's true, but I've been
The only
told
thing I have heard in regards to that is that some of them have like a weird maybe non-European interpretation of Roman Catholicism, where they basically have saints of like the drug industry, where their various cartel ventures, and which is not Christianity. I'm just going to be quite frank about that.
No, not at all. And these are just barbaric practices that they carry out. So,
I mean,
I've been hearing a lot of.
I haven't heard of any, blood rituals, but I mean, you go out in the desert to pray to a shrine of a skull for quote unquote, like, God help me run my cocaine. Like, Jesus Christ didn't, die on the cross and rise again for the grave for, number one, for people to live in habitual sin of, drug use. And number two, that you would, you know, um, allow people, by your business, basically, cause people to be living in habitual sin. The Bible talks about don't let, another brother slip into sin. You're being a stumbling block to people when you're, running, drugs. It's kind of obvious. It doesn't take a rocket scientist at NASA to, kind of figure that, hey, like, cocaine's bad, and maybe I shouldn't make it. Maybe it's hurting people.
Yeah, no, the drug cartel situation in Mexico and the Venezuelan gangs in Colorado and the border situation in general is going to come to a head now, I feel like. And, our history with Latin America has always been one of conflict, obviously, and intrigue. And I do believe that's going to continue to be the case, especially now more than ever before, because of the fact that so many different countries are interested in what happens there. We saw so I actually made a mistake. So the last time that the United States was directly involved in any major change in Latin America was the Panamanian invasion of 1989, where we did remove
Manuel
Noriega, just for that reason, that he was actually housing cartel members, if I'm not mistaken. He was providing refuge for them and also bringing their drugs through his country. So Operation Just Cause in '89 was carried out because of that. And then, of course, we were also indirectly involved in the assassination of Pablo Escobar as well, when they took him out. And I think that now, again, we're going to see an escalation in these sorts of operations. Because look, I'm totally against being the world's police, but when it comes to our national security, when it comes to our well-being, we need to get involved. We need to get involved, and we need to tell these countries, look, if you're not able to do what Bukele is doing, if you're not, actually trying to improve your country and put these people behind bars, we'll step in and do it because it's affecting us, and we can't have that anymore.
Did we not also fight FARC in Colombia and stuff too?
I think so. In a more clandestine level. We sent special forces over there.
I believe I've heard of Delta Force and stuff like that has operated against them.
Yeah, that's exactly. That was a Delta Force. They did operate against them in the early 2000s and in the 1990s. And again, I think we're going to have to see this again going into the future. And I think the new war on terror is going to be in Latin America. That's my prediction. And we're going to be back in Latin America. It's going to become the epicenter of a lot of future U.S. issues, aside from the Middle East, of course, aside from the situation in Israel, Palestine. Our next front is going to be there because, again, it's the closest threat that we have, and it's the one that's affecting us the most directly.
But it's also, I would say, involving other countries to some extent because, in regards to this, the border crossing, 20 years ago was all, mostly people from Mexico. Then you heard about, Guatemalans and things like that slipping past the cracks. But now that border has people from Africa coming through it. There's literally a town in Texas that's full of like 1,000 fighting age Middle Eastern men.
Yeah, no, it's outrageous. And
and now now you're hearing problems with Haitians and things of that nature. But last year, I think it's either last year or the year before, the Texas Rangers actually had to go and basically seize an island from the cartel. And they're lucky it didn't. I don't think there was any kind of fighting involved, but they were expecting to have to literally stack bodies and take this island from the cartel.
Yeah, no, and I'm pretty sure there were instances where similar incidents have occurred. And, excuse me, they're happening now. And this is why I feel like it's going to come to a head. I think that Trump has learned a lot from his last experience in the last administration, and I don't think he's going to go easy on Mexico this time. I think he really is going to build a wall and make them pay for it. I think he really is going to, toe a hard line, and that's the only way to do things. We are, whether we like it or not, we are an empire, and we have to secure our borders, and we have to, look after our interests, and that's the only way to get it done. Trump needs to do whatever it is that is within his power to ensure that these countries in Latin America, in our immediate orbit, are governed properly, as we did in the past. And we've covered so much about these filibustering expeditions, about the golden age of filibustering in the 1840s and 1850s, all the way on down to the Spanish-American War. So let's see what the future holds. Let's see if there will be any future movements in Latin America. Puerto Rico. How do you feel about Puerto Rico? Honestly, should we hold on to it, or should they have their independence? I mean, at this point,
I think, I mean, the way that U.S. history goes is that when you make something a territory, it becomes a state. I personally think, just for logic sake, they should probably make Puerto Rico a state and do their best to not give it much let them have their people in Congress or whatever, but don't give them like a lot of electoral power. That could because they're going to vote heavily Democrat, and Spanish is the number one language there. But I don't know. I've never really been the biggest fan of America, owning places that weren't states. Somebody might say, "Oh, well, Guam." Well, from my understanding, Guam has no native population. It's literally an island that has the military. So it's kind of like really a federal. It literally quite is a federal state. It's like DC.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Like
And you're right.
nobody's complaining there. Or you don't really ever really hear about people in DC complaining about, "Oh, we're not represented in Congress," when it's like they literally have Congress there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like tiny little island in the
Like that,
Pacific.
like the needs of DC could probably be more, would probably be met quicker than the needs of anywhere else in the country, just simply if a riot started in DC.
Yeah, yeah. But I do see the Puerto Rico eventually either entering the states, or some other major outcome coming about from there. And I love the Dominican Republic. They have a really base president now. His name is Luis Abinader, who's actually very pro-Trump, and he's trying to be Dominican Trump. And he actually, just last month, he began deporting 10,000 Haitians a week back to Haiti. And of course, the shitlibs here in the Biden administration, they condemned him. The United Nations condemned him. All the usual suspects condemned him. And that's a friendly government that we have in the Caribbean, who we sort of have some strings attached to.
Yes, we need to keep it. For this episode, I can't really think of anything else to really talk about, and I believe we've been going on for about almost 2 hours now. So if you want to, I would say we can probably end it and pick up if we want to continue with the Banana Wars.
Yeah, that sounds good, and thank you again for having me on. It's been a pleasure. Like I said, we covered this topic thoroughly. There was so much to talk about. It's interesting. At first, we were going to talk about it all in one episode, but obviously there was so much there that even I, a fan of this topic, this is like what I live and breathe. I was like, holy, I was like, whoa, there's a lot more here than meets the eye. This little bit of history, just these. There was so much there in the late 20th century that involved Latin America that it's insane. And it was such a pleasure to talk about it. So thank you so much for having me on again. I look forward to being back. And I'm on Twitter now. My Twitter is William Wall 1859. William Walker, that's me. The gray-eyed man of destiny. I reside somewhere out in the Golden Circle. They kicked me out of Nicaragua, as you know, so I can't be there anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, in Nicaragua. Wonder how old Raul Menendez is doing down there. I guess we'll find out next year when it turns 2025.
Yeah.
Uh, and then it's me. It's Otto Hawker. You can find me on Substack as Otto Wolf Helmson, and you can find me on Twitter as Otto Wolf Helmson, or just type in Otto Hawker. And as long as you see the medieval guy with the horse, you got the right guy. But we thank y'all again for listening, supporting this podcast. Um, we hope y'all have a good start to your week. Work hard. We hope this finds you in good spirits and a good mood. Thank you again for coming on, William. It's been a pleasure. I don't know much about Latin America or South America, and so I'm glad to have somebody that knows more about the Spanish right in America.
Well, it's a pleasure to provide that information, and thank you again. Have a great night, everyone. God bless the United States. We have a great 4 years ahead, so take care.
Yes, sir. God bless and take care, everybody.